Welcome to Beyond the Veil, where we peer into other dimensions and experience what lies beyond. It's always such an honor to come and speak at these events, mostly because it's an honor to be with you all. Thank you so much for coming, and thanks to my dear friend Doc for having this conference. And at these conferences, you're always connected with those other spiritually inspired beings who are seeking the higher light. I love this particular conference, Disclosure Con. Typically I go to events that are more spiritually inspired, higher consciousness, love and light, but I love to come to Disclosure Con and dive into disclosure because my life has been one as an experiencer. And so for my presentation, I decided that for the first time ever on stage, I would reveal my paranormal and supernatural experiences that started even before I was born. So I'm hoping that Doc can bring up my disclosure PowerPoint presentation on my thumb drive. There we go. Perfect. And then to switch screens, Doc, do I nod or do I have a remote or?
Just next screen.
Just next screen, okay. So I decided to call my presentation, What Fuels My Passion for Global Disclosure? And it does start with personal disclosure because my life as an experiencer and empath has everything to do with my passion for global disclosure. Next. When my father was 18 years old, him and 3 buddies were driving down a dirt road in Saskatchewan, Alberta, which I understand is a hot spot for UFO and Sasquatch activity. So they're driving down this road, and suddenly they experience this bright white light following them, in front of them, and then out in a field. And so my father, who was driving, decided to pull over and get out and see if this light would pass them. His 2 buddies in the back seat were terrified, but him and his best friend Don got out and they stood on the driver's side to see if this white light would pass them. Next thing he knew, they were all sitting in the car. What are we doing here? Let's get going. And as they started to pull off, they saw this bright white light connect with a larger orange light in the distance and shoot off into space. They were stunned, so they went to the nearest farmhouse and knocked on the door. The woman was furious that these boys were knocking on her door after midnight. Midnight? We just left right after dinner. And then they realized they had lost 4 hours of time. And they were stunned. The 2 guys in the back seat didn't want to talk about it ever again. But my father and his best friend Don were intrigued by what happened. The next morning when my father woke up, he felt a tingling on his wrist. And he noticed that there was a triangular-shaped object just under his skin. And he knew it had something to do with the experience from the night before. But he didn't want anyone to see it. He didn't want to tell anybody. When we were old enough to not be too freaked out by this story, he shared it with us. And growing up, he always called it his alien chip. Growing up with my dad, he was always pointing up into the sky and explaining to us the constellations, particularly Orion, and the nebula, or star nursery of the Pleiades. Next. My father grew up in a small town called Leader in Saskatchewan. He grew up in a one-room schoolhouse. A couple weeks after this incident, he's recruited by NCR, National Cash Register Company, to help them design better cash registers that were more like working calculators. Then he met my mother, got married, and NCR transferred him to Mount Shasta, where I was born. As a kid growing up in Mount Shasta, I played with fairies and elementals and trolls in the forest. My father was then transferred to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton. Next. When I was about 3 years old to the age of 7, I started to have nightly visitations. And it's funny because my recollection of them are cartoonish like this, and it kind of makes sense because I was just a kid. But they were blue, energetic beings who would come and visit me in the night, and they would stand on either side of my bed and one at the foot of my bed. And they would offer these energetic transmissions. And I knew that they were necessary. I knew that these were my loving friends and even family members who were coming to give me this energetic transmission for my health, well-being, and to upgrade me. Even as a child, I understood this. Then, when I was about 7, it started to fade out. My psychic awareness, my ability to tune in to the loved ones who had passed on, and the fairies and the elementals started to fade out, and these visitations stopped. Next. But before we move on from Mount Shasta, I wanted to share this experience that we had. When I was a kid playing in the forests of Mount Shasta, my mother would send our cat, Lucifer, of all names. But it was a big black cat, and it would chase off any critters as I played in the forest. One morning, my mother opened the door. Lucifer would always have some gift, a dead bird, a dead mouse. But this one particular morning, she opened the door and she screamed bloody murder. What was laying on the doorstep was a troll. She told us to get away from the door, but my sister and I both clearly saw this troll laying on the doorstep. My mother grabbed a blanket, wrapped it up, and buried it in the backyard. God's honest truth. Next. So just for a moment to go back to my father. So he was recruited to go work for NCR. He became a pioneer on the front lines of the emerging computer age. He was transferred to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. My father was German-speaking. On Sunday nights, these German men would come to our house, and my mother would usher us into the back bedrooms while these German men all had a meeting, looking at drawings, looking at plans. Now that I'm aware of Project Paperclip and how our government has been working with ET races for decades, I have to wonder, what happened in that experience where my father had missing time? And why did he get recruited into NCR and transferred to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base? And who were these German men he was working with? And how did he know all of this advanced knowledge about computers when he only had a one-room schoolhouse education? Was it his alien chip? Was that allowing him to download advanced knowledge, wisdom, and technology? Who knows? They're back. At the age of 29, I found myself living the American nightmare. It was meant to be the American dream. I found myself trapped in the matrix, following what society's expectations were of me. I went to business school, I married a corporate executive, I became a corporate executive, we moved to the East Coast, we bought nicer cars and bigger houses, until one day I found myself with a Porsche in the driveway and a pool out back, miserable. For me, the American dream was the American nightmare. I was trapped in the matrix and was suffering from many mental and physical conditions. My hair was falling out in clumps and my skin was falling off with eczema. I was being rushed to the hospital for anxiety attacks. Right about that time, the beings came back, but this time they looked different. They would come at dusk, and I would hear them come up the stairs and down the hallway, and I could feel their presence around me as they stood on either side of the bed and at the foot of the bed. But I couldn't see them. I could just sense them because I was paralyzed and I couldn't open my eyes or speak. I knew they were coming to do something similar to what the beings were doing when I was a kid. Some kind of energetic transmission. And the message that I got is, now is the time. So I had a hypnotic regression. Actually, it was only a couple weeks ago with a hypnotic regressionist in Sedona where I live. And of all the experiences, I never know in hypnotic regression which one's going to want to be shown, but I was spiraled right into my bedroom on the East Coast where these beings were coming to visit. And I was shown exactly what they looked like. And this is very similar. And even though this one has a bit of a menacing appearance, they were very benevolent beings, and I was told that they were Arcturian. They had dark skin, a rigid brow, ridges on their forehead, and a ridge running down their nose. They had a smaller nose and a small mouth, brown skin, and they wore a brown uniform. But this uniform was more like what you might see on an astronaut. And they had a round helmet, a clear glass round helmet, and they had a breathing apparatus that was like a corrugated hose that came out of this helmet and attached to their uniform. It was a breathing apparatus because they couldn't breathe in our atmosphere, but they could take their helmets off, they could take the glass helmet off temporarily, and they would do that when they would come to visit, to give these energetic transmissions and to communicate with me telepathically. And that's what I was shown in my hypnotic regression. They came back at that time, I believe, to move me out of that reality, to help me break out of the 3D matrix I was trapped in, and to have the next experience.